So, thank you for taking a couple minutes. And I know you work, tell us a little about what you do as a counselor and also your perspective of how spiritual health and mental health are linked. So I want to talk through a little bit about why it's important to consider mental health in a spiritual space.
Sure. So I'm a therapist, and I sort of see a generalized group of people and topics, but for sure anxiety is like paramount. It's one of the significant things I see, especially right now. This is like on next level what I'm seeing right now. And actually, mental health and emotional health are different things, although certainly linked. And I think in terms of this conversation, we're talking a little bit more about emotional health. So in terms of emotional health, what we mean by that is sort of your ability to manage the ups and downs of life from an emotional sense. How can we do that in a healthy way? How do we move through that in a way that feels healthy? And that's really linked to spiritual health. And whenever I get to have the opportunity to work with believers in the therapeutic sense, we can work through emotional health kind of at a quicker pace because we have spiritual health in the conversation. Because so much about your emotional reaction to the world is about what you believe. And so as believers, we have, truths of God to pull on as that influences our emotional health and our emotional world. So, what do you believe about God? Is he good? Is he sovereign? All of that impacts your emotional reactions to everything that's happened, good or bad, easy or hard. So that's sort of what we mean by emotional health and how spiritual health really helps.
So what do you say to the person that says, well, I have the Bible, I have Jesus, that's all I need? How would you address people that disagree on, like, the Bible's sufficient, we believe that. Bible's true, all the truth we need to know about God. But is there a piece of mental health and emotional health that, that is helpful for us? That, how would you address somebody that's a hater?
Yeah, hater. So I would just say, yes, it is all you need, right? But anytime a theology or a belief exists sort of high level and we don't pull it down into our real life, it's not a full belief, right? So just saying, well, I have God, it's all I need, is sort of void and lacking of the experience of God in your life, right? And I think part of spiritual health and what brings emotional health and can influence mental health is that wrestling with God in those hard places. And so if you're honest, you're going to say, when I'm up against loss, for example, is God good, right? And if you pretend to believe God is good without going down into the depths of those places, are you really getting to the deep places of belief and trust with God? So I think the experience of those truths is in real life, like where rubber meets the road. Mm-hmm. So it's just, I think it's incomplete. There's more of an experience with God.
So like pulling that theology down or like pulling it through the life circumstance,
right.
not just making
not just like a platitude.
Yeah.
Right? Because that is also really invalidating to the emotional experience. If you just like threw a truth bomb at someone and didn't sit with them in the experience of what is it like to be with God in the hard.
Yeah, good. So that's spiritual and emotional health. Well, let's talk about anxiety and how you define anxiety or what the differences of anxiety are, because people may have a range of experiences of anxiety.
Yeah. Well, I think it'll be helpful to talk about anxiety in terms of just the emotional reaction of anxiety, which is a human experience. Every human being is going to experience anxiety in this life, and that's more fear, worry, a sense of unease. Usually it's attached to an unknown, something I don't know is going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen. Typically has to do with a little bit of control. I don't know how to impact the thing that's going to happen, and you'll find yourself kind of doing that worst case scenario thing that we've all done. So that's the emotional experience of anxiety that human beings, all of us collectively have. And then there's more of like a disorder, an anxiety disorder, which is when we move more into a true mental health arena. And that has more to do with like a persistent, pervasive, sort of uncontrollable anxiety that lasts for a long time. And that's when we move a little bit more into not just, always coping skills, but you might be moving a little bit more into the territory of some medical help.
Mm-hmm. Right. So good to clarify. There's a general anxiety.
Yes.
There's an anxiety all people experience, and then generalized anxiety, which is like just like a persistent, like I experience life as an anxious person.
Yes.
And just consistently.
And not always attached to a specific moment or scenario, like just a generalized, consistent, pervasive, anxious feeling.
It's like something that sits on you or weighs on you all the time, and you experience the world through your anxiety rather than having anxiety about an experience.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
good.
yes, exactly.
So, what I'd like to do is talk about how to deal with anxiety as a Christian, and how to understand God's intent for peace in us, and how to seek peace in the midst of something that may be anxiety producing.
Okay, so I'm going to approach this sort of from a practical standpoint because I think these tools are really helpful. They're connected to the spiritual life for sure. And I think they're helpful across the board, whatever camp of anxiety you find yourself in, whether you're just the human experience of anxiety or you are struggling with sort of the mental health arena. These tools are helpful for both. The second category may need a little extra help for sure. So first I would say, and this is a little bit connected to your mindfulness comment, which is that there's a physiological response to anxiety that all of you have felt, racing heart, rapid breathing, uneasiness in your stomach, those kinds of things. And sometimes those can be so elevated that it's really difficult to move into the kind of belief system areas. And so with the mindfulness approach, what we're kind of trying to do is get your body to calm down. So that feels a lot like deep breathing and feet on the ground. And sometimes there's even a visualization of trying to visualize it leaving your body. And while that can sound a little like, I don't know, Eastern or something like that, it's really just the idea of how do you calm yourself? How do you calm down before you even can get to the place of, what might God be saying to me? So I always like to start there, even with my clients, because sometimes that's the first thing they'll notice before they even can connect to what they're anxious about. They cannot even get themselves to calm down. So I always like to start there. I know that's really practical, but it's very helpful to move into the next part, which is actually one of the greatest helps to anxiety is a little bit of a cognitive approach, which is about what you believe and what you know, which really impacts our emotional world and how we're interpreting things and how we're responding to things. So as a believer, this is why I love so much doing work with believers, is because the anxiety is so greatly impacted by your belief system. So the questions I'll just give you 2 questions that you can ask yourself that are really helpful. One is, because there's a worst case scenario thing happening with anxiety almost every time, right? There's a fear of the unknown, or I don't know what to do, or I can't influence the change I want to see happen. Is you ask yourself, okay, what is my worst case scenario that I keep playing over, and what if we follow it to the end? Well, what would happen at the end of that? And as a believer, what you find is, well, what do I believe about God in that place? What do I know about God in that place? And that greatly impacts your emotional response to the moment. And the second one is, you've got a lot of I don't knows going on. So if you ask yourself, well, what do I know to be true? This really, really helps people who love God and believe God, because they go, well, here's what I know to be true. God's good. God's for me. God's with me. And these kinds of repetitive conversations with yourself, it's bake in the deep truths of God that some people throw as platitudes. They become real. And then the other one is, and I think this one's really important for believers because we want it to be true that if I just believe God's good, I won't feel this anymore. And that can really be stressful for us as believers because we kind of go, I know I'm supposed to believe he's in control. Why do I still feel anxious? And that actually makes us more anxious because we're fighting this fight with ourselves, that we're mad at ourselves that we can't get it to work or something. And so this is when I always want to say a little bit of acceptance actually is very helpful. And I don't mean acceptance like defeat. I mean acceptance like, oh, right, being anxious is part of being a human, and Jesus was too, right? That's the garden. That's the sweating of the blood before the cross. That's the human experience that Jesus himself, evidenced for us. And so accepting a little bit that this is part of the emotional experience of Jesus, it's okay for a believer to have it, really takes it down to a calmer place where you can listen to God again. Last thing I would note is that this is definitely a repetitive process. This is how do I continue to do this work so that my brain has a pathway connected to this instead of just fear?
And so I guess faith becomes the continued persistent reliance on God over reliance on experiences and circumstances. So that becomes we call faith a muscle, right? We're exercising trust in God versus, allowing these circumstances to define where we are, right? So
Yeah,
it's a continued pursuit,
Yeah.
and continued desire.
Yeah, I would say it's absolutely continued, and it's your whole life. That's the faith experience, I think, in the world is, and it's a perfect example of what I mean by high-level truth. How do you get the high-level truth to mean something? Is you do that over and over again, with honesty and authenticity with God. I'm in the low, and I'm really stressed, so be with me.
Yeah, good. And then last question I have is, if maybe I don't have anxiety presently, but my friend or someone in our church is struggling with anxiety. How do I help someone who's in a place like that? What's the best way for me to help them pursue peace with God in their life?
Yeah. So I think the ministry of presence is always your best bet, always, with something like the emotional world. So being with somebody, like your example about sitting with Pierce while he made the call, presence, like loving, consistent, faithful presence is really helpful for anxiety. So they're not alone. And because when you're alone, this is when your thought life becomes a little off kilter. So I would say the ministry of presence is always the first go-to. And patience, because it's not a quick turnaround as much as we would like it to be. Those of us in anxiety wish so badly it was a switch that you could flip. But when you have people who would walk with you over time and who are willing to sit through it, that's really beautiful and really helpful. I wish I had a third P. That would have been perfect.
What was the first two?
Presence and patience.
Presence
it would
and
have been
patience.
awesome. Sorry.
Presence,
And I think truth.
Patience and persistence.
Get a P for truth, something like truth.
Persistence? Truth P. Anybody got truth
I
P?
feel like I'm on Wheel of Fortune.
Leads to
Truth
peace.
leads to peace. Perfect.
Persistence, patience leads to peace.
Okay. So also
Way to
truth,
go,
like
Bartek.
in that sort of place of logic where you're asking yourself those questions, having somebody with you to remind you of truth. Like, okay, well, what would happen at the end of that thing you're afraid of? Remember who God is. Remember who He is. So bringing truth to that sort of conversation with self.
Yeah, that's so helpful. Thank you for taking time to do this. And is there anything else you would say to the church around mental health and around spiritual, emotional, mental health, where we are today, and just the, what do we need to understand about church and the world and just life today that will be helpful?
Ooh, that's
I mean, if
big
not
question.
anything, I don't know.
It's like a second sermon up here. Well, if you don't mind, I'm gonna keep it to anxiety because that's what we're on today, and I think emotional health is so broad. Well, I'll say one high-level thing, and then I'll say one final thing on anxiety. High level, what I would say is, in terms of emotional health, the goal is not to not feel the hard things, which is often what people don't really realize that's what they're asking for. Like, I don't want to feel this hard thing. If I'm a good, faithful Christian and my spiritual life's healthy, I'll only feel this. And that's just not anywhere in Scripture to me, and it's certainly not in any of my experiences with believers in the world or just humans in the world, right? Like, emotional health is, I can feel this hard thing with authenticity and keep moving through it in a healthy way. So I would just say that high level because we're in very stressful times. I mean, we're pushing a year of pretty significant isolation, and I'm definitely seeing a huge spike in my clients who are just hitting a wall. So don't be surprised yourself if you're feeling it, and don't be afraid of the feelings that come with them. I would just encourage you to work with them, work through them with God.
That's good.
And with each other. And then, that sort of ties into what I would say specifically about anxiety is, again, to not be so afraid of anxiety itself, because we want to fight it so hard, and it tends to fuel anxiety when we do that. So just know it's human, and Jesus experienced it, and He is, He's a great high priest who is not unsympathetic. He walked with us in our shoes and has experienced all that you have. So that's true with anxiety too.
Great, cool. Thank you. Would you pray for everybody and pray for our church?
Glad to, yeah. Oh, God, we're just so grateful that you did walk exactly what we're walking, and that you know the experience of our emotional world, that you felt it, and that you can empathize. That you're not frustrated with us when we are fearful or anxious or worried, Lord, that you instead understand us, and that you are gracious and merciful to us in those spaces. And we know that you are with us, Lord, and I just ask for all of these people, myself included, Lord, that when we're in those places of fear and worry, that you would meet us with truth. Father, that you would help us remember who you are and what your presence is like, and that you would help us remember your grace and mercy for us as we are struggling. And I just pray for a fresh filling of your Spirit for us as we have walked this long, long road of uncertainty, and that there's still kind of not a light at the end of the tunnel or an end date on some of this, Lord. In this particular season, I just ask that you would care for your church in a special way, that you would meet with us individually as we're isolated in our homes, that your presence would fill us and fill our homes, and that when we are able to gather, even like today, Father, would you just right now just fill all of us with a fresh wind of life, Lord. And we are grateful, grateful, grateful beyond words that you love us and meet with us and have experienced what we have experienced. I pray all that in the good name of Jesus. Amen.